Hi, I'm Kenny Coleman, a technical marketing engineer for Tanzu Community Edition. And in this video, we're going to set up Tanzu Community Edition with Amazon Web Services to use managed clusters. Setting up AWS has 3 succinct steps. After Tanzu Community Edition and the AWS CLI are installed on your machine, we're going to install JQ and create a new key pair for each region that will be used. Then we're going to create a management cluster and then finally create our workload clusters. Here's a quick architectural overview of managed clusters with Tanzu Community Edition. The first Kubernetes cluster to be deployed is a management cluster. This Kubernetes cluster will have Cluster API installed and knows how to talk to our target infrastructure through APIs that are used to provision new virtual machine instances and consume network and storage resources for the Kubernetes cluster. And in this instance, AWS will be our target infrastructure. Using a declarative model, workload cluster specs will be applied to the management cluster that will define what a cluster looks like, such as how many controller or worker nodes should be in the workload cluster. This is shown with the number 1 in purple on the slide. The management cluster will be responsible for the lifecycle management of the workload clusters, such as scaling, updating versions of Kubernetes and components, and deleting clusters as well. The workload cluster is where all our applications will be deployed and is depicted with the number 2 in purple utilizing kubectl. After this has been completed, you have an environment that can be used for a wide range of application deployments, and you can also create more workload clusters if needed. Tanzu Community Edition has some prerequisites. Docker or Docker Desktop must be installed and running on your local workstation. If you're using Docker Desktop, the amount of RAM for the application needs to be 6 GB or greater to run the containers required for creating the Bootstrap cluster. Use one of the many options to install Tanzu Community Edition on your local workstation. After the installation is complete, the Tanzu CLI will be available for you in your terminal. Next, install the AWS CLI using any of the supported methods depending on your preference and operating system. And now we have the AWS CLI available. Next, we need to install JQ, and this is to process JSON when creating SSH key pairs. There are many methods, but using Brew on Mac makes package management very simple. The AWS CLI requires credentials to authenticate and perform its actions. In a typical AWS environment, this can be found by going into the Identity and Access Management or AIM console. From here, select your username and select Create an Access Key. Save the new access key and the secret key, but you can also download the key pair into a CSV file locally on your machine. We can configure the AWS credentials using one of 2 methods. The first is by setting the environment variables using the export command. However, this is usually only temporary. To save them indefinitely in a configuration file, use the command AWS configure and then paste your access key, secret key, and the region that you would like to use. I already have this configured in my environment, so I'm not going to overwrite my settings. For each region inside of AWS that you plan to use Tanzu Community Edition, you need to create a named key pair and output a .pem file that includes the name. For example, the following command uses default and saves the file as default.pem. We can log in to our Amazon EC2 dashboard and go to the Network and Security tab and look at key pairs to verify that the key pair is registered with my account. To ease the creation of the management cluster, there is a graphical user interface to bootstrap this process. And this is accessed through the command Tanzu Management Cluster Create with the flag UI. Click on the Deploy button for Amazon AWS. In the Infrastructure as a Service Provider section, select the credential profile, which would be the default that we created earlier. Then select the region to deploy the management cluster. This region must have at least 3 availability zones, and the region must also be registered with the SSH key pair that we entered earlier. Once the connection is successful, click Next. In the VPC for AWS section, create a new VPC or select an existing one. The next section defines the sizing properties for the management cluster. Choose a development or a production cluster, which will determine if the Kubernetes control plane will have 1 node or a highly available 3-node deployment. Choose the size of the nodes for the management cluster. If this cluster will manage lots of clusters, the size should correspond accordingly. For testing and development, an M4.large will work just fine. Supply any cluster name, and then set the EC2 key pair that was created earlier, and if this is the first time deploying a cluster, select the Automate Creation of AWS CloudFormation Stack checkbox. The CloudFormation Stack creates the identity and access management resources for Tanzu Community Edition so it can deploy and run the clusters on AWS. Next, select a worker node instance size and click on Next. Optionally, fill out any metadata fields that can be used to provide descriptive information about the cluster. In the Kubernetes Network section, you can accept the defaults for the CIDRs or optionally change them. If you would like to authenticate to OIDC or LDAP, that information can be placed in the Identity Management section. If not, this can be turned off. Now choose the operating system image and the Kubernetes version that you would like to use. If you have Tanzu Mission Control, the setup can be automated here by placing the registration URL. Click Next to review the configuration and click on Deploy Management Cluster. This whole process will take about 15 minutes to complete. Going back into the Tanzu CLI, use Tanzu Login to choose the management cluster that was just created. To make creating workload clusters simple, we're going to copy the management cluster configuration file to a template. After the template is created, we can edit this as needed, but we can see everything on here was inherited from the management cluster configuration that was done prior. The Tanzu cluster create command requires the name of the new cluster to be specified along with the values file from the template that we just made. This process will take just a few minutes to provision the virtual machines and the cluster creation to be completed. The virtual machines are available in our EC2 dashboard as well. And using Tanzu cluster list, we can see that the cluster is up and running when we're authenticated to the management cluster. To interact with this cluster, pull the kubeconfig and then set the context to the cluster. And now we can view all the pods running in the cluster. Thanks for watching this demonstration on getting set up with Tanzu Community Edition and Amazon Web Services using managed clusters. Remember, always refer to the documentation for the latest updates.